I want it to make me feel things. I want it to startle me.
The 5 tenets of horror for the Callisto Protocol are
brutality,
atmosphere,
tension,
helplessness,
and
humanity.
The Callisto Protocol is mastering horror.
That was scary!
The Callisto Protocol is not a game I was expecting to cover on this channel, nor was it a game I even thought I would end up playing, as I was never really that hyped for it to begin with. I do recall watching G-Man Live's review when it came out last December, but I honestly remember none of that video, which I'm not sure if that's more of an insult to G-Man or the game.
What is that supposed to mean?
Developed by a studio called Striking Distance, made up of former devs from Visceral Games, the Callisto Protocol was touted as a spiritual successor to the Dead Space series, even being directed by Glenn Schofield, who produced Dead Space and was at one point the vice president of Crystal Dynamics. Most of the reason why I was never that hyped for Callisto Protocol was because the Dead Space games never really made much of an impression on me. Yeah, I did play the first 2 games and enjoyed them for their fun Resident Evil 4 and space-styled gameplay, but over the years I never felt a strong urge to replay them, or even give Dead Space 3 a proper go. I usually just end up replaying Resident Evil 4 or Doom 3, which I'm overdue a replay of.
welcome to the dungeon, Marine.
When the Callisto Protocol launched in December 2022, I recall it receiving pretty mixed reactions from what I saw online, particularly around the state of performance with the PC version. Some people called it the worst AAA horror game they'd played in recent memory, others found the game to be just average, and then a few people I know actually really enjoyed it and called it underrated. It was also kind of unfortunate that the release was so close to EA's remake of Dead Space, which launched over a month later in January this year, which I have not played, so I'm not going to be making any comparisons to that remake here.
You can tell me, are you different? Are you special?
But that was a year ago, so why am I suddenly deciding to give this game a go now, and even talk about it? Well, it was free on PlayStation Plus back in October, and then it took me nearly 2 months to actually sit down and play through the whole thing. Finally getting a PS5 and Spider-Man 2 may have had a part in that, and wow, what a whiplash to go from Spider-Man 2 to this. Now that I've played through the entire campaign and its DLC chapter, is this one of the worst AAA survival horror games, or is it actually an underappreciated horror gem? Well, let's find out, shall we?
And mates, I gave you a direct order.
So, the Callisto Protocol revolves around a transport pilot named Jacob Lee, played by Josh Duhamel, who is shipping cargo from the Black Iron prison on the moon Callisto with his crewmate, played by the guy who voiced Carlos in Resident Evil 3.
Now here's a weird fucking door.
After he's attacked by a terror cell and crash lands back on Callisto, he's rescued by Captain Ferris, played fantastically by Sam Witwer, and for reasons unclear is arrested and then detained in Black Iron prison. Just as a viral outbreak then happens to occur within the prison, and Jacob then has to fight for survival as he tries to escape. It's a pretty straightforward and very familiar kind of sci-fi horror setup that is carried fairly well by the actors, particularly Karen Fukuhara, who some of you might recognise from The Boys. Josh Duhamel does a fine job of what he's given with Jacob, but the real scene stealer in this game is without a doubt Sam Witwer, and if we're going to throw around the word underrated, it definitely applies to this man. From his work in Star Wars Clone Wars to his more recent titles like Days Gone, which totally deserved a sequel, this guy just always delivers stellar performances.
Alright. In my mind's eye. Kenobi. Kenobi!
In fact, one of the many disappointments for me with the Callisto Protocol, well, that didn't take long, is that Sam is sorely underutilized in this game. Most of his big scenes take place near the start of the game, and then he's pretty much gone for most of the campaign till near the end, which is a damn shame.
Think I got time for this shit? Okay. Let me see if I got this straight.
His performance stood out in a way that felt similar to Troy Baker's role as Higgs in Death Stranding. You can just tell that these guys are veteran performance capture actors when you see them chew the scenery with such a level of fearlessness.
Careful. Contents are fragile. Like the world and everything in it. Me, I'm no exception.
The feeling of familiarity becomes a bit stronger once you actually start playing the game. Some of the DNA from Dead Space is definitely still here in the Callisto Protocol. There's a definite sense of weight to how Jacob moves, the stomp ability from Dead Space makes a return, all of the game's UI is diegetic and part of the character, just like Dead Space 2, and of course the game has a heavy emphasis on visceral horror, combined with some absolutely stunning art direction and honestly quite staggering production values. I played through the PS4 Pro version of the game and it still looked incredible, really pushing the Unreal Engine 4 to its limits. It's really hard to fault this game visually, with so many of the environments looking and feeling like you're walking through the set of an Alien film. The way the lighting is so artistically crafted throughout this facility that is falling apart, combined with effects like snow and fog, really is quite jaw-dropping at times. Not to mention the impressive character rendering and some of the best facial capture tech seen to date probably, the art team did a really great job. Combine it all with some really good atmospheric sound design, the fact that former devs from the Dead Space games worked on this, and you'd think all of the ingredients would be here to make a really great survival horror experience.
Well, yeah.
It's kind of a pity then that the Callisto Protocol just isn't scary. Like, at all.
Okay, let me see if I got this straight.
It was almost kind of sad watching through the behind the scenes documentary with how much they were trying to hype up how scary they thought the game was, to the point that there are interviews with iconic horror writers like Robert Kirkman and even a clinical psychologist talking about the fundamentals of horror. I honestly can't remember the last time my experience of a new horror game was so passive. I never really felt all that tense. In fact, I played the majority of the game whilst laying down on the couch, and the game never really provoked any physical reactions out of me, outside of a couple of annoying jump scares in the early parts of the campaign.
That was scary!
So why isn't the Callisto Protocol scary then? Well, it's a combination of some really odd design choices in the gameplay and also just the story itself. Alana Pierce pointed out in a video that she did that for the character Jacob, this is a pretty low stakes story for him. His only real goal and motivation is survival, which in of itself isn't actually a bad thing. Many horror games also fall back on the simple goal of a character trying to survive. Resident Evil does this all the time quite well, even when some of those games get rather goofy and ridiculous. But the reason it works so well most of the time in Resident Evil is because the characters are given a decent amount of characterization and conflicts outside of just purely surviving. Using Resident Evil 2 as an example, Leon is a rookie cop on his first day on the job where he finds himself in a nightmarish zombie outbreak. And what makes his journey compelling is his naive hero complex as he genuinely tries to do his job in a situation that he hasn't been trained for, and when he's been explicitly ordered to save himself.
Fine, but I'm coming back for you. Just hold on.
Plus, he's also trying to reunite with and help save Claire Redfield, who he meets at the start, giving him interesting motivations and conflicts. Jacob, on the other hand, is a relatively blank slate of a character, despite being performed by a film actor. There's not really much going on with his character, and most of the conflicts he faces are just roadblocks between him and his goal of escaping Callisto. He also never really seems to react like the events unfolding around him are affecting him that much. Right from the get-go, he just seems to be very capable and relatively in control. Like when the game first explains the combat system, Jacob just seems to be able to effortlessly dodge attacks and takes on the first monster without an ounce of hesitation. Contrasted back to Resident Evil 2, Leon and Claire both have panicked reactions to the first zombie and seem hesitant to shoot. Then throughout both campaigns they continue to be startled and comment on combat encounters, whereas Jacob on the other hand just never seems to react at all after the many repeated jump scare sequences where a monster jumps out from a loot crate or ensnares him when he walks through an open door. It just creates this kind of emotional disconnect from who you're playing as, and it almost begs the question of why bother casting a film actor if the character isn't going to be particularly reactive or expressive. Of course, not all game protagonists have to be expressive or even compelling to make a game scary. I mean, Isaac in the first Dead Space was a silent protagonist, and Amanda Ripley in Alien Isolation wasn't much to write home about, and yet that's one of the scariest games I've ever played.
Okay, let me see if I got this straight.
What further prevents the Callisto Protocol from ever feeling all that scary is down to a number of clashing design systems that revolve around the game's core combat mechanics, which isn't good considering this is almost an entirely combat-driven horror experience. The first thing to note is that even though this game is touted as a spiritual successor to Dead Space and shares a few similarities that I mentioned earlier, the Callisto Protocol doesn't really play anything like Dead Space, which was very heavily influenced by Resident Evil 4, an industry-defining third-person shooter. For the most part, the Callisto Protocol is primarily a pretty visceral melee combat-focused game. Yes, you do unlock guns throughout the campaign, but it's not until near the end of the game that I felt my playstyle shifted more towards leaning on the gunplay, and I had a stockpile of ammo at that point. The Callisto Protocol primarily focuses on engaging enemies in close combat with your stun baton, and then dodging any enemy attacks by moving the left analog stick in one direction and moving it in the other direction for any subsequent attacks, and then attacking again. This is the core combat loop in a nutshell. Of course, it does evolve over the course of the game as new enemies are introduced, along with the addition of guns. There's a mechanic that's introduced where if you successfully execute a combo attack on an enemy, you're then rewarded with a free shot at said enemy's weak spot with your currently equipped gun, and some enemies will mutate after being damaged too. And again, going back to the visuals of this game, a lot of the gore effects like the dismemberment system, similar to Dead Space, is very impressive, and some of the death animations are shockingly over the top. Very weird that there's a DLC pack that includes more death animations though, I must admit.
Yeah, telling me.
The issue with these combat mechanics that very quickly arises is that the melee system and the animations associated with it soft lock you onto the one enemy you're engaging with. This is fine when you're only engaged with one enemy, but more often than not the Callisto Protocol has you facing more than one enemy at a time, sometimes in restrictively tight hallways, and it becomes a game of running around trying to separate the enemies enough that it's safe for you to begin attacking, since yes, your attacks can be interrupted. This can get frustrating at times since Jacob runs fairly slowly and enemies have a habit of performing lunge attacks that can hit you as you're trying to run away and create distance. I can sort of see where they were going when they added guns into the mix, the idea that you use guns to stun the other enemies before you pummel the nearest one with your baton, or at least I think that's what they were going for. But in the early hours of the game it doesn't really change the fact that most combat encounters will play out the same way. Then you get access to a telekinesis ability, which enables you to grab and throw certain projectile objects at enemies, and also grab most enemies themselves and throw them into a number of environmental hazards that start popping up throughout the world. And I'm not gonna lie, it was cathartic at times just picking up enemies and dismissing them by flinging them into a nearby ventilation fan, and then watching them disappear into a lovely red mist. But then another issue arises from this new addition to the combat in that there isn't really much penalty from this point on to now rely on using telekinesis, since you can use these environmental hazards as much as you want. You do have to recharge the telekinetic gauntlet with batteries, but once you bought a few upgrades for the capacity and propulsion strength, it sort of becomes a non-issue. It got to the point with some of the late game combat encounters where I just stood next to a ventilation fan and then waited for the enemies to come to me, and I would just throw them in, completely trivializing the combat to the point that it's not intense or even remotely scary.
Think I got time for this shit?
There are also some stealth mechanics thrown in as well, because every AAA game these days has to have a stealth system apparently. But there's really only a few specific areas of the game where stealth gameplay is forced or encouraged. Like down in this mining area, there are large groups of these blind enemies that can easily mob you if you're careless. But this section I found laughable because of just how over the top Jacob's stealth animations are, and the fact I was doing them right next to other enemies and not alerting them.
bullshit!
It reminded me of how silly Ellie's stealth animations were in The Last of Us, but see, I can forgive that because The Last of Us was a PS3 game that came out 10 years ago, and Naughty Dog hadn't made a survival horror before. This is essentially what I mean when I said that I had a pretty passive experience with the Callisto Protocol, because the combat became so repetitive and trivial so quickly. Plus, most of the monsters in this game feel really uninspired. They're just kind of various mutations of zombies that beeline towards you as soon as they can. One of them explodes, as I found out after I shot it, and I died because there wasn't anything about its design that obviously indicated it was an exploding enemy type. There's one two-headed boss monster that was initially kind of cool, until he became a recurring enemy type that was just boring to fight because you only had to dodge one of his attacks and aim for his heads. But then there were also a couple of design choices that really frustrated me too, like the game's really archaic inventory system that only lets you hold 6 items for half the game, and the majority of said items like health stims, batteries and components you collect to sell for money don't stack, meaning you run out of inventory space really quickly, and then you have to drop items in the hopes that there is a shop nearby to sell components, and then go back and pick up the health stim you dropped. That is assuming you don't enter a new area that's a point of no return to the previous area, which the game will never warn you about.
This is bullshit!
Your inventory does double to 12 slots in the second half of the campaign, but it doesn't really solve the issue because by then you will have more guns with different ammo types and the problem still persists. I know that the Resident Evil remakes also have limited inventory systems, but you find and upgrade the capacity of it so much faster that it's not an issue. Plus, you generally don't need to carry as much stuff in those games. What frustrated me the most was the baffling design decisions they made when it came to healing and recharging the telekinesis. To recharge your telekinesis, you have to open up your inventory, navigate to a battery, and then use it, just like Resident Evil. The issue, however, is that unlike Resident Evil, the game doesn't pause when you open the inventory, and because of how generally slow Jacob runs and how hard it often is to put distance between enemies, more often than not it's too risky to try and use a battery in combat. This confusing design is compounded further by the fact that healing is done by pressing a single button. Why recharging the telekinesis couldn't also be done with a single button press baffles me. But then it probably wouldn't have made a difference anyway because for some reason the healing animation is so ridiculously long in this game, as Jason will take his sweet fucking time to get down on one knee and slowly inject the health into his neck. This basically means you can only heal and recharge outside of combat encounters, which feels so tedious and can lead to many cheap feeling deaths in combat encounters where you know you could have succeeded if you didn't need a 10-second window in order to heal.
Think I got time for this shit?
It also doesn't help that the UI for your health and telekinesis is so hard to read most of the time that you can die without even realizing you are one hit away from death. Which is a confusing oversight considering the UI in Dead Space was very similar, but much easier to read in the heat of the moment by comparison, and that game came out 15 years ago.
This is bullshit!
And the thing is that the developers were 100% aware of how frustratingly restrictive that healing animation is, because in the final boss fight of the main campaign, there are many health vials that only require you to walk over and press X to use them, littered throughout the arena. Although by that point I had stocked up on so much ammo and the boss itself pretty much boiled down to just circle strafing it.
I told you. This is my kingdom.
The whole time while I was playing the Callisto Protocol, what kept running through my mind was that I couldn't believe just how unengaged I felt during combat, due to how restrictive so much of the core game systems were. And this was coming after recent action-driven horror games like Resident Evil 3 and The Last of Us Part 2, that had dodge mechanics integrated into their systems. Resident Evil 3 lets you dodge by simply tapping circle and moving in a given direction at any time, and if you timed the dodge just right as an enemy attacked, you were given a small window of slow motion to either attack or dodge again. And then The Last of Us Part 2, for as much as I don't like that game's story, had one of the most fluid and engaging stealth-driven action combat systems I've played. Its dodge animation was a kind of hybrid of the RE3 and the Callisto Protocol, where there were specific animation blending systems that would trigger when enemies tried to melee attack you, but it also didn't completely soft lock you since you could also completely dodge out of the enemy's attack cycle, which was handy if other enemies turned up and started shooting at you from nearby.
Well, I guess you got it all figured out. I guess so.
But then even with all that said, I still wouldn't call the Callisto Protocol a bad game per se, and it's certainly not the worst AAA horror game I've played. And if you've never really played that many horror games before, there's every chance this game might be a lot more enjoyable for you, and even scary. And as previously stated, this game is an absolute visual tour de force, and a real showcase for what's becoming possible with new graphics technology. Funnily enough, the game that came to mind as a comparison to that notion is a little game a lot of people have completely forgot even existed, that being 2015's The Order 1886 by Ready at Dawn. I also completely forgot that I had a copy of that still sitting on my shelf. That game was a fairly generic cover-based third-person shooter styled after games like Uncharted, but it was an extremely impressive tech demo that still manages to look really striking even in 2023. I mean, heck, Digital Foundry recently did a retrospective showcasing it. Even though I can't really say that I enjoyed a lot of my experience with the Callisto Protocol, I was intrigued enough by the story and the art direction to want to see the game through to the end, even though I rolled my eyes when it all boiled down to just an alien virus being weaponized by a corporation that had built a secret facility under the prison to hide said facility. The game ends on a cliffhanger and an incredibly obnoxious jump scare that the game was already full of, and because it didn't appear that Markiplier played the full game, I bought the DLC Chapter 2 called Final Transmission, and it's mostly more of the same. It was nice that you got to keep all of your items and upgrades from the main campaign, as the DLC did seem to feel a lot more action heavy, and a bit more like Dead Space, I guess. There were also some fun hallucination sequences that were a welcome reprieve from the annoying jump scares in the main campaign. Dare I say it, but I actually almost started having fun near the end when you unlock the kinetic hammer that just brutalizes enemies, and there was a cool sequence in a hallway that just let you go to town on waves of lesser enemies. But then the last few encounters reinforced the same healing and recharging issues from the main game that felt really cheap, and I'm ashamed to admit that the final boss pissed me off to such a degree that I actually lowered the difficulty.
Think I got time for this shit?
I'm not kidding when I say that this fight took me over 20 attempts before I lowered the difficulty, as the boss loved to do this really cheap stomp move that would be an insta-kill if you didn't block it. And then the big payoff, the resolution to the cliffhanger from the end of the main campaign. Yeah, the whole DLC was a dream sequence as Jacob was dying after saving Danny from the facility as it self-destructed.
What? What?
What?
I've never been so irate in my whole fucking life.
This has probably been one of the harshest reviews I've done on this channel so far, and typically I don't enjoy trashing games, and the fact that the game did so poorly critically and commercially which led to layoffs was pretty sad. Even the studio's founder Glenn Schofield, who posted an ill-received tweet that seemed to glorify crunch culture, has seemingly abandoned ship too. Anyway, those have been my numerous thoughts on the Callisto Protocol. Let me know your thoughts in the game in the comments, and have any of you played the Dead Space remake? Is that worth checking out now that I have a PS5? Until next time, stay safe out there everyone, avoid being attacked by face-hugging monsters, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Think I got time for this shit?